Hola, it's Joe Pardavila. Welcome back to another episode of Forbes Books Radio. And you may not be aware, but October is National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And this year's theme is Do Your Part, #BeCybersmart. It's encouraging individuals and organizations to take proactive steps to enhance cybersecurity and protect their part of cyberspace. And joining me today is a security management expert and founder of VigiTrust. He's also the author of the upcoming book, The Cyber Elephant in the Boardroom. His name is Mathieu Gorge. Hello, Mathieu.
Hey, Joe, how are you?
I'm good. So let's start by talking about The Cyber Elephant in the Boardroom, your new book. People have lots of reasons for writing books, but what was the main reason for you to write this one?
Yeah, so I've been in security for 20 plus years. I'm very passionate about security, passionate about cyber. And over the last years, I suppose I've been interacting with board members and CXOs, so CEOs, CFOs, CISOs, and so on. And I also host an advisory board where I bring those guys in a think tank type of environment. And we've been thinking about how we could demystify cybersecurity for people that need to make decisions every day that are based on technical systems and may not actually be technical themselves or legally minded. And so the idea behind the book is a methodology that I created a few years ago called the 5 Pillars of Security Framework. And it's extremely simple. It's based on the idea that whether you look at regulation or standards in the US, in Europe, in Australia, in China, in Russia, wherever it is in the world, you always dial back to 5 key common denominators: physical security, people security, data security, infrastructure security, and crisis management. What do you do when something goes wrong? And so having worked based on that methodology with a wide number of international companies and their CEOs and their board members, I thought that perhaps it might be time to make the methodology more well-known, even though it's already an award-winning methodology. And so a few members of the advisory board said, hey, you should maybe have a try at writing a book. And here I am.
And you did mention about the fact that a lot of your work is dealing with the C-suite, dealing with executives, and that's actually an early part of your book mentions it as well, is the fact that CEOs are such a good target for hackers. So let's go back to what you originally said. When you are explaining all of these issues to these corporate giants, do you feel the need like you have to dumb things down in a certain way so they get it? Because they're not CTOs, they're not programmers, they don't write code. How are you able to deliver that message in a way where they can understand it?
You know, most of those guys and ladies are very accomplished, right? So they've started businesses, they've sold businesses, they're managing either small scaling businesses that are doing extremely well or extremely wide and complex businesses throughout the world. And so one of the key things is to make sure that when you talk to them in a language that they can relate to in plain business English. So for instance, you want to avoid 3-letter acronyms that we love in our industry, especially given that most of them can be interchanged on a regular basis. And so you're right, they're not necessarily legal experts or technical experts. So you do need to bring the conversation to a level where any business person will understand what you're talking about. And that's actually why, if you look at the 5 pillars and the 5 themes, you know, physical security, people security, data security, infrastructure security, and crisis management, where you could apply those 5 terms not just to cybersecurity, but to financial risk or geopolitical risk, maybe even HR risk. And so those words they actually can relate to. Now, the next level after that is to say, okay, well, now let's try and explain to you how you can link cybersecurity to those 5 pillars. And then suddenly the discussion starts becoming a bit more in-depth. They start asking questions. They start saying, oh yeah, actually, I can identify with that problem. I can identify with that challenge. I know a solution for that. And that's really where you want to get them to in a reasonably small amount of time.
In a way, you know, as an entrepreneur, which essentially you are, and I think there are some entrepreneurs that are good at this and there's some that are not, but the selling aspect of it, because that's probably something you probably didn't realize when you probably started your career, was like, I'm going to have to figure out a way to sell this to people who don't speak my language. How did you come to that point? Was that something that came to you, were you able to develop that skill over time?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think that my early career, I was actually selling firewalls and content security and web security for value-added resellers in Ireland. And when it was time for me to move on and start my own business, what I wanted to do was to sell data security training to decision makers. And I was hit with a brick wall nearly every time because they were saying, look, and you have to remember that was nearly 20 years ago. They were like, this is really novel, the whole idea of data protection and the whole idea of protecting your personal information from cyber attacks. Yes, businesses and governments were being attacked, but not necessarily individual citizens. And so I think that very quickly I understood that I needed to sell not just to the immediate buyers, which would be the IT managers, the compliance managers, and so on, but the C-suite and above that to the board. And one of the key issues that we have even today is that cybersecurity doesn't necessarily make it as a regular agenda on the board. And so it should really be there the same way as you look at financial risk and you look at business continuity and so on. Cybersecurity should be there. And so I often talk about the 5 stages of cyber accountability grief. The idea is that many people will be familiar with the 5 stages of grief, where you start with denial, then you go to anger, then you go to bargaining, then you go to depression, and finally acceptance. Well, that concept is a very easy concept to apply. So if you try and understand how the board of a large company is dealing with cyber accountability, which really is their accountability towards government, towards clients, employees, and so on, in order to make sure they have the right levels of cybersecurity, the first thing that they do is go through denial. I don't need to know about cybersecurity. It's not my problem. I have a chief compliance officer. I have a chief security officer. I have a team. I have an IT team. I have a support team. They can deal with that. It's not my problem. I want to talk about strategy and growing the business. The next step is anger. Well, why is it my problem? Why are you bothering me with this? Like, especially right now, people are saying, don't bother me with it. I have to deal with a crisis already. I don't want to hear about cyber. The next one is bargaining. It's like, okay, I can see that if I don't do it, I might get in trouble, and it might be sending the wrong message. So I'll do a little bit of it, a la carte, like it's on the menu. But that's not the right way to do it. Then finally, depression. Well, now that I realize everything I have to do, the technical stuff, the policy, the training, the ongoing management, it's too much. I'll never get there. But the good news is that you can get to the acceptance stage. And the acceptance stage is where you realize that with the help of a good, simple, plain English, timeless, industry agnostic methodology like the 5 pillars, you can actually drive your board and your senior management team towards a very good security level and therefore achieve cyber accountability.
It's funny with cybersecurity. It's very much like being a goalkeeper in football, or soccer as we call it in the States, is you never really talk about the goalkeeper unless he does like a knuckleheaded move, if he comes out of the net and he does something silly. In a way, that's the world you live in, where you don't talk about cybersecurity until it fails. Like, until the goalkeeper gives up that bad goal, you don't really want to even talk about it.
Yeah, and that's one of the key challenges for very good security professionals and compliance professionals. If they do their job the right way, nobody knows about them. And in fact, the better they are, the less anyone knows they're around. If, on the other hand, they mess up once, suddenly the spotlight is on them, on their team, on what they should have done, on what they shouldn't have done. And to be fair, most times they'll say, well, look, I was trying to do the best I could within the budget. Right. I was trying to get into the board meetings at least once a quarter, and some of them at least once a year, or at least once every 2 years. And we know that that's not the right thing to do. Security needs to really come from the top. And actually, it's another concept that you'll find in the book, which is the fact that I often say that security is a journey and not a destination. And so, yes, you can have a few pit stops along the way. One day you'll validate your compliance with PCI. You'll be able to talk to the regulator and say, I'm in compliance with CCPA or with GDPR or whatever applies to your organization. But that's only a point in time compliance. A few minutes later, you're probably out of compliance because your environment is always evolving, the threats are always evolving, and the bad guys don't stop. They keep going. It's great that you become compliant and that you address the known threats, but you need to do that on a regular basis. Hence why it's an ongoing journey, not a final destination per se.
Well, it is funny, though, with that, as you know, from working with all these businesses and business leaders, is there's so much in this OKR, KPI world where they're hitting all these goals and dividends and budgets. But when it comes to security, that doesn't really exist. It's sort of an ongoing thing. It's like always keeping the coffee machine full of coffee. You don't think about it until it runs out of coffee.
Yeah, and a lot of them actually start their security strategies that way. They'll allocate a bucket and they'll say there's a bucket of money, a bucket of time, bucket of people and resources. Go and make us compliant, go and make us secure. But the challenge of the CISO or the compliance person is to say, well, you're going to have to keep filling that bucket up because it's an ongoing thing. And I think that's why it's very, very important to get board members aware of their cyber accountability mandates and aware of the fact that they need to have a cybersecurity checkpoint, so to speak, at every board meeting. How are we doing? Are we progressing? Do we have a strategy? We know that we're going to double in size in the next year or so. How is that going to impact on cyber? Or, as the case might be in a time of crisis, well, we know that we might have to essentially get smaller for a little while. How does that impact our security? Maybe we need to outsource some stuff instead of having it in-house. What's the impact on cyber? And you can't really trust the board to do that if they haven't been fully made aware of their responsibilities towards cyber.
Right.
And their responsibilities they're reasonably simple in my opinion. It's ensuring that systems are secure, ensuring that staff are trained, ensuring that there's good policies, and as you said, that there are KPIs. Now, the KPI element is extremely interesting because within the 5 pillars of security framework, we have 2 versions. One that we call super strategic, where we ask 5 questions per pillar, and one that is strategic and allows you to start implementing the strategy with 12 questions per pillar. The questions are phrased in a way that you don't need to be technically minded or legally minded to answer. The questions are typically, are you happy or confident that you have physical security in place? Are you 100% happy that you've got a crisis management plan? So all of the questions are reasonably easy to understand regardless of your role within the board or the C-suite, and they eventually give you a score. Now, there's 2 types of scores. There's a score where each question has 1 point, so all of the questions are equal, but in real life, we know that it doesn't work like that, so you've got a way of using a weighting system, and that gives them a KPI. The reason why I think it's important is that, let's say that you're breached. If you're breached, the regulator or the enforcement body is going to come knocking at your door before you can actually get yourself a cup of coffee. It's going to be so fast. So you need to be able, at a click of a button, to produce your own KPIs as regards cybersecurity and cyber accountability. And my experience over the years is that the enforcement bodies and the regulators may well understand that you weren't fully in compliance at the time, but you had a roadmap and everybody was made aware and it was high on the agenda. Something went wrong, it happens. They will work with you on that basis. But if you have nothing to show, no education for the board, no demonstration of cyber accountability, no training for senior executives, you're in big trouble, and you want to avoid being there.
It's so funny how you've thought of everything in terms of like the KPIs as gamifying it, because at the end of the day, all these corporations are gamifying their systems by hitting these points each day or week or quarter or everything like that. So did you realize that you needed to add that element to really lock in a lot of these people that are incredibly data driven in terms of what their production is at the end of the day?
Yeah, I think you're right. They're totally data driven, and one way to lock them into that program on an ongoing basis is to give them benchmarks or milestones that they can identify with, stuff that they can put into a report, stuff that they can show the regulators and that they themselves can explain to the regulators, as opposed to saying, here's a lovely graph that my compliance officer produced on my PCI and my HIPAA compliance.
Right.
That's not good enough. If you're at the top, you can't be an expert at everything, but you need to be able to say, this is what we've done. We've educated ourselves. We're benchmarking ourselves every 3 months, and we can actually show progress. And we know the areas that require immediate attention, and we're providing the resources for that. We also know that some other areas are kind of good to have, and right now we're concentrating on something else, but it's on the roadmap. And that's a message that's acceptable, I think.
Absolutely. And one of the things speaking to is I see a lot of similarities, and this may seem really out of left field, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of similarities between cybersecurity and the pandemic and the importance of preparedness. Matthew, I'm sure you remember back in March when we were all running out of PPE and masks and medications. And in a way, COVID and cybersecurity are very similar, where you have to be prepared for that day when something happens.
Yeah. So first of all, this terrible pandemic was part of some organizations' crisis management plan. So they didn't know what the pandemic was going to be about, but some of them did have pandemic response plan, although very few did in fairness. But a lot of organizations have a crisis management plan, and they'd have a business continuity plan. And so what we would advise them to do is to map out the various scenarios that could apply to their organization. On that basis, say, okay, well, what's the likelihood of that happening? What would be the impact? And what measures can I put in place to essentially reduce the impact? And I end up with a residual risk that my business needs to accept or needs to mitigate further. And so the fifth pillar is within the 5 pillars is crisis management. And it's really all about, we know there's going to be a crisis at some stage, right? So if you look at the Verizon data breach investigation report over the last few years, the amount of time between the time the breach happens and the time that it's discovered has been averaging between 260 and 300 days, depending on which report you're looking at.
Let me stop you there, Matthew. Why does that happen? I always feel like a lot of these breaches, when they do happen, especially when it comes to data and personal information, it's way after the fact. It's like, we discovered this 2 months ago. Why does it take, especially some of these major companies, so long to realize the breach?
So I think there's a technical aspect to it first, and then there's a business aspect. So if I look at the technical aspect first, I'm like, you won't notice a breach unless it's bringing your systems down, right? Or unless you have the right levels that it's picked up and you've actually invested in the right technology. But if you haven't, you won't actually notice it. You will notice a denial of service attack because all of your websites will go down, but you may not notice somebody who's put in a backdoor to your credit card system because all they're doing is coming in and out and just taking batches of credit card numbers until they have enough, and then they go. And you realize at some stage that maybe some of your cards have been used fraudulently, and you get Visa might actually come to you and say, we think that you've had a breach, or maybe some law enforcement agency will say, well, we think that there's some cards coming out of your systems that are being used fraudulently. But it's not immediate. It's only after the fact.
Wow.
Right?
So you're saying a lot of these company breaches, they find out about it through law enforcement and through credit card companies. That's sort of the initial red flag that goes up a lot of the times with these situations?
That happens a lot, yes. It's not unique, but it does happen a lot. And then, in fact, what we always recommend is that you build a relationship with law enforcement before you have a problem. You need to understand how they think, and they need to understand your systems. That way, if there's a problem, well, you can actually work as a team as opposed to in an adversarial fashion, especially given the pressure you'll be on. When the breach comes out, whether it's 30 days or 280 days after that, your organization is going to be under so much pressure. The board will be on top of the technical team and the compliance team. The compliance team and security team will be trying to understand what's going on. The PR folks are going to try to manage the PR disaster or make sure that it doesn't become a disaster.
Yeah.
And so the last thing you'll want to do at that stage is try and build a relationship with law enforcement. You need to have that relationship built before. Hence, why you always go back to the board. This should be part of the strategy, and it should be part of the crisis management at board level.
And I want to talk about one of the hacks that happened earlier this summer was the Twitter one, when someone gained access to the Twitter admin tool on the company's network and then hijacked a bunch of high-profile accounts. And this is a super oversimplified question, but how does stuff like that happen in these huge tech companies? Because like you said, Matthew, a lot of the problem that you deal with are people that don't get it. But obviously a company like Twitter gets it. So how does that happen to a company like them?
I'd have to refresh my memory about that very one, but if I'm correct, I think that it was a mix of human error and social engineering. Obviously, high profile organizations and people that have jobs with responsibilities that give them access to that type of systems have always been targets. And so if you are working in a database environment or you're a security administrator in a big company that has access to a lot of data, a lot of high profile accounts, you're going to be a target. And it's the role of it's the responsibility of the business that's employing you to train you the right way, to train you to recognize that, to also provide you with ethical training on, what is ethical to do, what isn't. How do you recognize that you're being attacked, that it's a social engineering attack against you, and what do you do to address that? Now, of course, you can't legislate for bad people, and there's bad people everywhere. But the reality is that if you've got the right systems in place, you do the right level of training, you make security awareness an ongoing thing, and then you've got the right controls at the back end, from a technical and a policy perspective, you minimize that risk. But that risk will never be zero, I'm afraid.
Yeah. You brought up an interesting topic there about human error, because as much as we talk about having all these systems in place and having all these firewalls put up, at the end of the day, a lot of it sometimes rests upon human error. It could be that one IT person leaving a computer unlocked or having their own accounts hacked where then people have access to a corporate account. How much of that is a bigger problem than being actually physically prepared for a cyber attack?
The reality is that we're all human beings. We make mistakes. Some make mistakes on purpose. Some are just overworked. Some are not trained the right way. We collectively have a responsibility to maintain the systems and access to data. And I think it's a cultural thing. So cybersecurity should be part of the DNA of an organization. The same way as cyber accountability should be part of the DNA of the board and executive team. And so if you manage to do that, you will greatly reduce the risk of human error, at least folks that actually want to abuse the system. You were talking about gamification earlier on.
Yeah.
I also think that it's important to make sure that cybersecurity is not seen as that thing that nobody can understand and therefore it's not my problem. And we can really demystify cybersecurity very easily throughout the enterprise, for the board with the 5 pillars, down to anybody within the organization by explaining security in a very, very easy way. And I remember actually going back down memory lane for a second. I remember how content security was explained to me when I started working in security in Ireland 20 years ago. Somebody said to me, picture yourself going through an airport. So you arrive, you've just landed, and you go through passport control. That's your firewall, that's your IDS, that's your IPS. And then you go through customs. That's your content security, where I'm going to go through the traffic, through the attachments, and so on. It's a very easy concept to grasp. And if we explain it in plain language, I think we're on to a winner.
In a way, in your world, you have to be the master of metaphors and analogies, because you need the airport analogy or the goalkeeper analogy I used earlier, because a lot of people sometimes need that sort of, oh, I get it that way. I didn't understand the way you said it before, but when you said it that way, I totally get it.
Yeah, it's a case of making sure that people can understand how it applies to them on a daily basis, and throughout life. Cybersecurity, it's not rocket science from a conceptual perspective. Of course, I couldn't write code for encryption. I couldn't invent the latest firewall for the industry, but I can easily explain how they all relate together, how they all, like different pieces of Lego that work together. And so the challenge that we have right now is that oftentimes it's too fragmented. So you've got some very good people on the board that are excellent at strategizing for growth, but don't understand cyber. You've got some very good folks on cyber and compliance at maybe senior executive level or C-level. You've got very good technical people. You've got people within the organization that are manipulating data, transferring data, creating data, but don't understand the value of that data. And so all we need is a simple approach to make sure that it comes down from the top to manage all of those challenges. And I contend that the 5 pillars is just so simple that it can easily be understood by everyone in the organization.
No, I definitely got that from the book. Mathieu, I'm sure as you realize, I'm not a very bright fellow, but your book is very easy to consume for dummies like me, but also incredibly intelligent. And I have just one personal question before I let you go, because I've really enjoyed this conversation, but there's a cybersecurity software company that recently figured out how to hack into a smart coffee maker, and they use the machine to ask for money. So our homes are filled with smart devices. Like, Mathieu, if you came to my house, I have every smart device possible. I got lamps, I got speakers, I got like an Alexa in every room. Are any of those devices secure at all? Or are we pretty much being like, we're hoping for the best?
So it's an interesting one. I think that, yes, more and more devices are connected in your home. And that's a good thing because it makes life easier and it also makes it more fun. The challenge with those devices is that typically they're not built with security in mind. They're built with usability in mind. How am I going to make it easier for Joe to get his fridge to replenish itself on a regular basis by contacting the local supermarket and paying with the credit card that's on file? That's usability, but the security behind that is always an afterthought. The other thing to bear in mind is that the life cycle of those devices, maybe not for a fridge, but maybe for some lights or a coffee maker or a tea maker, the life expectancy of a device like that is maybe 3 to 4 years, because after 3 to 4 years, wear and tear, you're going to change it. Or you
want the new one. You want the latest one.
You want the new one,
yeah.
And are you really going to set yourself an alarm every 3 months to download the latest firmware for your coffee maker? I don't think so. Maybe you are, but most times you're not. And so in the end, you end up having maybe on average 25 to 50 connected devices in every household in the US. That actually means that you've increased your risk surface by a lot. And so the challenge is to make sure that you do keep the software and the firmware updated, but from an IoT device, Internet of Things, like connected device, it's difficult. And there are some new regulations coming out in the US, in Europe at the moment around making sure that manufacturers put in security by design when they build the code and when they build the firmware and so on. We are making progress, but unfortunately, it's actually slower than the growth of the number of devices within your house. So the main thing here is to make sure that you update them and also that you protect your router and your firewall, because otherwise I can actually hack into all of those devices from across the street, and that wouldn't be a good thing.
No.
Unless you want me to make coffee for you.
Yeah,
remotely.
Mathieu, actually I could use a cup of coffee right about now. That'd be nice. No, but his name is Mathieu Gorge. He is the founder of VigiTrust and the author of the upcoming book, The Cyber Elephant in the Boardroom. Mathieu, thank you very much for the time, and I want to wish you a happy Cybersecurity Awareness Month.
Thank you so much, Joe. A pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
And that's it for this edition of Forbes Books Radio, available for you to listen and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Google, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please, don't forget the golden rule and treat others as you want to be treated. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adios.
This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio. Find out more at ForbesBooksRadio.com.